The diesel engine of the tow truck whined like a dying Tyrannosaurus Rex, black smoke belching into the pristine, aggressively beige morning air of Boca Raton, Florida. I stood in my driveway, barefoot in a waffle-knit bathrobe, taking a long, slow sip of my dark roast coffee. It was 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the air already tasted like humidity and expensive lawn fertilizer. The tow truck driver, a guy named Rick, whose sweat-stained shirt suggested he was already having a terrible week, slammed his massive hand against the steering wheel. The heavy-duty winch cable was pulled so taut it was humming, vibrating with thousands of pounds of mechanical tension. And at the other end of that cable, a literal 4,000-pound rusted iron maritime ship's anchor. It wasn't just sitting there, it was structurally integrated into the exact center of my driveway pavement. Standing off to the side, vibrating with a rage so intense it was practically visible, was Brenda. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair was frizzing in the humidity, and she was aggressively jabbing a manicured finger at my property line, screaming something about code enforcement that was completely drowned out by the failing transmission of Rick's tow truck. I took another sip of my coffee, let out a contented sigh, and waved at her. To understand how I ended up defending a 2-ton nautical artifact from a middle-aged woman in a golf cart, we have to rewind exactly 3 weeks. 3 weeks ago, my life was simple. My front yard was just as boring and meticulously manicured as every other yard in the gated community of Whispering Pines. The only distinguishing feature of my property was a modest 3-by-5-foot flag planted near my garden gnomes. It wasn't a political statement. It wasn't an inflammatory slogan. It was a picture of a sea turtle with the words, "Keep our oceans clean." That's it. A turtle. A reptile that spends 90% of its life minding its own business and eating jellyfish. But in the eyes of Brenda, the newly elected president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, I might as well have been flying a banner declaring war on property values. I was pulling weeds near the mailbox when she rolled up. The Whispering Pines HOA patrol vehicle was a golf cart outfitted with an entirely unnecessary amber flashing light, which she left running just to make sure I knew she was operating in an official capacity. She stepped out, wielding a metal clipboard like a broadsword. She was wearing those oversized bug-eye sunglasses that completely hid her eyes, making her look like a very judgmental insect. "Excuse me, Jack," she chirped. The tone was artificially sweet, the kind of voice people use when they are absolutely thrilled to ruin your day. "We need to talk about the display." I stood up, wiping dirt off my knees. "The display? You mean the begonias? I know they're looking a little dry, Brenda. I'm adjusting the sprinklers." "Not the plants, Jack. The flag." She tapped her pen against the clipboard, pointing it at the completely motionless, unbothered sea turtle. "It's a violation of the new community aesthetic guidelines. We passed a resolution on Tuesday." I blinked. "A resolution against turtles? Did a rogue tortoise attack the clubhouse?" She didn't smile. People like Brenda are physically allergic to humor. Their bodies just reject it. The board voted to amend Section 4, Paragraph B of the bylaws. The community has instituted a strict ban on all political, philosophical, or non-aesthetic fabric displays. We are maintaining a uniform neighborhood profile. "Brenda, it's a turtle," I said, my voice dropping the polite, neighborly act. "Since when are turtles a political party? Are they running for the Senate? Is there a robust aquatic voting bloc I'm unaware of? Environmentalism is a philosophical stance, Jack, she countered smoothly, already pulling a bright pink carbon copy citation slip from under her clipboard's clamp. And frankly, the bright blue background clashes with the community-approved neutral earth tones. You have 24 hours to remove it, or you will be fined $100 per day. Have a blessed morning. She slapped the pink slip onto my mailbox, climbed back into her tactical golf cart, and buzzed away, leaving me standing in the Florida heat with a piece of paper that effectively cost more than my first car. I looked at the turtle. The turtle looked at me. Did she really think a laminated pink slip was going to stop me? I'm not a man who handles petty authority well. I don't just get mad, I get systemic. I went inside, grabbed a cold water, and sat down at my computer. I treat malicious compliance the way a hyper-organized project manager treats a multi-million-dollar corporate pipeline. I literally opened up a fresh Notion workspace, created a Kanban board, and titled the project Operation Salty Vengeance. First things first, I needed data. I logged into the Whispering Pines HOA portal and downloaded the complete, unabridged, newly updated community bylaws. It was a 98-page PDF, written in the kind of suffocating legalese designed to break the human spirit. I spent the next 6 hours reading every single line, highlighting definitions, cross-referencing aesthetic clauses, and mapping out the dependencies of their rules like I was offboarding a nightmare client. I wasn't looking for a way to break their rules. Breaking the rules gives them power. Breaking the rules gets you fined, sued, and a lien placed on your house. No, I was looking for the exact microscopic boundaries of their rules so I could aggressively color inside the lines. By 2:00 a.m., my eyes were burning, but I had found it. Section 4, Paragraph B. The very rule Brenda used to target my sea turtle. It read, "Homeowners are strictly prohibited from erecting, flying, or displaying any flags, banners, or fabric signage containing political messaging, philosophical slogans, or non-aesthetic graphics that disrupt the uniform suburban environment." It was a brilliantly vague trap. Anything could be deemed philosophical if Brenda felt like it. But as I cross-referenced the definitions section, I noticed a glaring omission. They had banned the content of the flags, but in their rush to outlaw my turtle, they hadn't put a hard cap on the nature of the flagpole itself, provided it didn't violate the height restrictions of standard landscaping. More importantly, they defined prohibited displays as items promoting civic, political, or social movements. Piracy is not a social movement. Piracy is an opportunistic maritime career path. The next morning, I walked out to the garden, gently pulled the sea turtle flag from the soil, and rolled it up. Brenda drove by exactly 20 minutes later, slowing her golf cart to a crawl. I gave her a crisp, exaggerated salute. She smiled, a thin, victorious smirk, and drove off, fully believing she had established dominance. She had no idea I had just spent $300 on overnight shipping for industrial-grade aluminum tubing, high-tensile nautical rope, and a custom-ordered piece of heavy-duty, weather-resistant nylon. 2 days later, the delivery truck arrived. I spent Saturday morning working in the driveway with a socket wrench and a concerning amount of enthusiasm. I didn't just buy a flag, I constructed a tactical, heavy-duty, reinforced mast. I dug a 3-foot hole right next to my mailbox, poured fast-setting quikrete, and sank the base of a 5-inch thick, steel-reinforced pole into the ground. It was completely compliant with the property line setbacks. It was exactly within the landscaping height limit, and once the concrete cured, I rigged the halyard and hoisted my new purchase. It was a massive, unapologetic 5 by 8 foot Jolly Roger. The skull and crossbones were stark, aggressive white against a pitch-black background. It caught the Boca Raton breeze immediately, snapping in the wind with a sound like a cracking whip. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was completely visible from 3 streets over. The reactions were instantaneous. My next-door neighbor, a retired accountant named Gary, who spent most of his time polishing his lawnmower, walked out to get his paper, stopped dead in his tracks, and actually dropped his mug of coffee on the sidewalk. A minivan full of soccer kids drove by, and I could hear them cheering through the open windows. And then, right on schedule, the amber flashing light appeared at the end of the block. Brenda's golf cart was moving faster than I thought legally permissible for a battery-powered vehicle. She hit the brakes so hard she left tiny skid marks on the pavement. She practically vaulted out of the driver's seat, her clipboard already trembling in her hand. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, tearing off her oversized sunglasses so I could see the absolute fury in her eyes. "Take that down! Take it down right now!" I leaned against my mailbox, perfectly relaxed. "Morning, Brenda. Just updating my aesthetic profile. How's the uniformity looking?" "It's a pirate flag," she screamed, pointing up at the skull that seemed to be grinning down at her. "It is violent. It is aggressive. It is a massive political statement." "Actually, Brenda," I said, pulling a folded copy of the bylaws from my back pocket like a magician producing a card. I consulted the guidelines. Section 4, Paragraph B outlaws political messaging and philosophical slogans. Piracy is neither a political party nor a philosophical stance. It's an antiquated economic model based on unregulated wealth redistribution on the high seas. Furthermore, under standard maritime doctrine, the Jolly Roger is technically not a display. It's an operational warning sign. It communicates that I am prepared to give no quarter. Are you asking me to remove a safety warning, Brenda? She was breathing heavily, her face turning a dangerous shade of magenta. "I am calling an emergency board meeting. You are making a mockery of this neighborhood. That pole isn't even standard. You can't just sink a steel pipe into the ground." "Read the bylaws, Brenda. Landscaping structures must not exceed 15 feet. This is exactly 14 feet, 9 inches. Have a blessed morning." I turned and walked back into my house, leaving her sputtering in the driveway. The adrenaline rush was incredible. It was better than caffeine. But I knew this was just the opening skirmish. I had fired the first shot across her bow, and the HOA was going to retaliate with everything they had. I went straight back to my Notion board and moved Phase 1, Instigation, to the completed column. It was time to start prepping for the counterattack. The summons arrived taped to my front door the very next day. An emergency hearing of the Whispering Pines HOA Board of Directors, scheduled for 7:00 p.m. that evening at the clubhouse. Attendance mandatory. Failure to appear would result in automatic default judgment and maximum fines. They were trying to rush me, trying to catch me off guard before I could mount a defense. It was cute, really. I showed up to the clubhouse exactly at 7:00 p.m., carrying a thick binder perfectly indexed with colored tabs. The clubhouse was a monument to terrible 1990s interior design. Faux leather chairs, aggressive floral carpets, and a distinct smell of chlorine from the adjoining pool. The board consisted of Brenda and 4 other residents who looked like they were being held hostage. Brenda sat at the center of the folding table, her hands folded over her metal clipboard. "Let the record show that the homeowner of Lot 42 is present," Brenda announced to the empty room, using a cheap digital recorder to capture the moment. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing. "Jack, we are not going to play games today. The board has reviewed your installation. And we have voted unanimously to pass an immediate addendum to the architectural guidelines. She slid a piece of paper across the table. I picked it up. It was a freshly typed, highly specific rule change. Addendum 4C. All freestanding flagpoles, masts, or vertical mounts are hereby banned from front yards, driveways, and visible side yards. Only standard, angled wall mount brackets attached directly to the primary dwelling are permitted. All non-compliant structures must be removed immediately. She leaned back in her chair, a smug, triumphant smile spreading across her face. You see, Jack, you wanted to exploit a loophole about the type of flag. So we just banned the pole. Your steel pipe is illegal. You have 12 hours to cut it down and restore the concrete, or we will hire our own contractors to remove it and bill you for the labor, plus a daily fine. I looked at the paper. I looked at Brenda. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just nodded slowly. So, to be absolutely clear for the recorded minutes, the board is officially mandating the removal of my freestanding pole, strictly enforcing a ban on any vertical masts in the yard. That is correct, she said, practically vibrating with victory. Checkmate, Jack. Understood, I said, closing my binder. I stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked to the door. I'll have the pole removed by morning. I could hear her laughing as I walked out of the clubhouse. She thought she had won. She thought she had crushed my little rebellion with the stroke of a pen. But she had fundamentally misunderstood the game we were playing. She was playing checkers with neighborhood rules. I was playing 3D chess with federal law. As I walked back to my house under the glow of the streetlights, my mind was racing. I couldn't use a flagpole. Fine. The HOA bylaws restricted aesthetic structures, architectural additions, and landscaping mounts. But there is a very specific, incredibly powerful set of rules in the United States that completely supersedes the petty aesthetic guidelines of a suburban homeowners association. It is a legal sledgehammer that HOA boards are terrified of, precisely because they have absolutely no jurisdiction over it. I didn't need a flagpole. I needed a federally protected utility installation. I got home, poured myself a glass of water, and booted up my computer. I opened up the official website of the Federal Communications Commission, FCC. Specifically, I navigated to the regulations regarding PRB-1, amateur radio preemption, and the OTRD, over-the-air reception devices, rules. The law is incredibly clear, beautifully rigid, and federally enforced. Under FCC regulations, state and local authorities, including, explicitly, homeowners associations, cannot pass rules that effectively preclude amateur communications. They cannot enact blanket bans on the installation of antennas, masts, or signal receivers necessary for communication. If an HOA tries to force a homeowner to take down a functional radio mast, they aren't just breaking a local rule, they are interfering with federal communications infrastructure. I smiled, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. I wasn't going to build a flagpole. I was going to build a commercial-grade, deep space, capable, heavy-duty amateur radio lattice tower, and I was going to put it right in the middle of my driveway. I spent the next 3 days executing a masterclass in operational logistics. First, I had to be perfectly legal. I applied for and passed the basic examination for my FCC ham radio operator license online. It took 48 hours to get my call sign issued by the federal government. I was now an officially licensed, federally recognized amateur broadcast operator. Next, I needed the hardware. I didn't want a flimsy little wire on my roof. I wanted a monument to malicious compliance. I found a specialized telecommunications contractor 2 towns over who dealt in decommissioned commercial gear. I hired a crew, 4 rugged guys who looked like they chewed gravel for breakfast, and explained exactly what I wanted. Mike, the foreman, stood in my driveway the following Tuesday, scratching his beard with a thick, calloused hand, as he looked at the blueprints I had drafted. "So, let me get this straight," Mike said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. "You want my crew to core drill through your driveway pavement. You want us to sink a 40-foot steel lattice telecommunications tower into the concrete. You want us to paint the steel to look like distressed maritime oak." He paused, looking down at the notes. "And you want us to attach a complex rigging of high-tensile steel guy wires branching off the sides?" "Exactly," I said, handing him a perfectly organized folder containing the FCC OTARD regulations and my ham license. "It's for catching the best radio waves. Ground-level interference in Boca is terrible. The rigging is structural. Obviously, it stabilizes the mast against hurricane-force winds." Mike looked at me, looked at the perfectly beige houses surrounding us, and slowly started to grin. "I hate HOAs, man. My cousin lost his truck to one of these boards over a parking sticker. You're actually doing this?" "I'm fully permitted by the federal government to ensure uninterrupted signal broadcast," I said deadpan. Mike laughed out loud. "We'll have the rig here by Thursday. It's going to be loud, it's going to be ugly, and it's going to be glorious." Thursday morning, the Whispering Pines community woke up to the sound of heavy diesel machinery. It wasn't just a pickup truck. Mike brought a flatbed carrying a massive, segmented steel lattice tower, accompanied by a hydraulic crane. The noise of the core drill biting into my concrete driveway echoed through the entire neighborhood like a declaration of war. I was sitting on my front porch, drinking coffee, watching the chaos unfold. Neighbors were stepping out onto their lawns in their pajamas, staring in absolute disbelief. Gary, the accountant, actually crossed the street to get a better look, shaking his head in silent awe. By 10 a.m., the base was sunk and secured. By noon, the crane was hoisting the upper segments of the tower into the air. It was a 40-foot monstrosity of steel triangles, painted a ridiculous, textured dark brown to mimic wood grain. It loomed over my house, a jagged industrial middle finger aimed directly at the HOA clubhouse. Brenda arrived at exactly 12:15 p.m. She didn't even bother with the golf cart. She drove her Lexus SUV onto the grass of my front lawn, slamming the door so hard I thought the window would shatter. She marched past the contractors, ignoring the hard hat zone, and stormed right up to my porch. "What is this?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "What are you doing? I told you to take the pole down." "I did, Brenda," I said politely. "The pole is gone. I complied perfectly with Addendum 4C. This is not a flagpole. This is Sovereign Maritime Relay Station 4. It is a federally licensed primary broadcast and reception antenna for amateur radio communications." She stared at the 40-foot steel tower, her brain struggling to process the sheer scale of the spite happening in front of her. "It's an eyesore! It's an illegal structure! It violates every single architectural guideline in the charter! I am calling the police! I am calling the city code enforcers! I am fining you $10,000! "You can try," I said, leaning forward. "But before you make any phone calls, I highly recommend you consult your HOA legal counsel regarding FCC Rule PRB1. The federal government strictly prohibits you from restricting my antenna. If you attempt to halt this installation, you will be interfering with federal communications infrastructure. The FCC Enforcement Bureau does not mess around with HOA busybodies, Brenda. The fines start at $16,000 per day, levied against the board members personally." She froze. The color drained out of her face. She was a petty tyrant, used to bullying people with aesthetic guidelines. She was completely unequipped to handle federal preemption laws. You can't just— "Oh, but wait," I interrupted, standing up. "Mike, are the structural guy wires ready?" "Ready to rig, boss," Mike yelled down from the boom lift. I walked over to the base of the tower and picked up a heavy, bundled package. I attached the brass grommets to the steel cable system Mike had installed specifically for this moment. I gave the thumbs up, and the winch motor whirred to life. Brenda watched in pure, unadulterated horror as the massive 5 by 8 foot Jolly Roger was hoisted high into the air, snapping violently in the wind at the 30-foot mark of the antenna. "You're flying that violent flag again," she screamed, pointing at it. "Even if the tower is legal, the flag violates the rules. We banned fabric displays." "Ah, yes," I said, pulling another laminated sheet from my pocket. "About that. While researching federal protections, I realized that my spiritual needs were being neglected. So yesterday, I was officially ordained as a minister of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Pastafarianism is a legally recognized religion in the United States, Brenda. And under the tenets of my faith, full pirate regalia is considered a sacred religious garment. Therefore, the Jolly Roger is not a fabric display. It is a religious symbol." I handed her a copy of the Federal Fair Housing Act, FHA, with the section on religious discrimination highlighted in bright fluorescent yellow. Under the FHA, the HOA cannot discriminate against or prohibit the display of religious symbols on a homeowner's property, I explained softly, making sure she caught every word. "If you try to make me take down my sacred pirate flag, I will immediately file a federal discrimination lawsuit against you for violating my civil rights." So, to recap, the tower is protected by the FCC. The flag is protected by the FHA. And my driveway? I gestured to the fresh white lines Mike's crew had painted, turning the asphalt into a distinct rectangular zone. "Is now officially a dock." Brenda looked at the document. She looked at the giant pirate flag flying from a commercial radio tower. She looked back at me. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She simply turned around, got into her Lexus, reversed aggressively off my lawn, and sped away. Mike walked up next to me, wiping grease off his hands. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Do you even own a ham radio?" "I bought one on Amazon yesterday," I said, grinning. "It's still in the box, but the signal is going to be incredibly crisp." The neighborhood was in an absolute uproar. By that evening, pictures of my tower and the Jolly Roger were circulating on the Whispering Pines private Facebook group. The comments were a war zone. Half the community was terrified I was driving down property values, and the other half was practically begging me to install towers in their yards too. But I knew Brenda wasn't going to give up. The HOA had a reserve fund, and they were going to use it to hire lawyers. I had to secure the perimeter. I needed an anchor. A literal anchor. Which brings us back to Tuesday morning, 7:15 a.m., barefoot in my driveway, watching Rick, the tow truck driver, lose his battle with physics. After Brenda fled the scene on Thursday, she convened a secret, closed-door executive session of the board. They realized they couldn't touch the federal protections of the tower or the religious protections of the flag. So, they pivoted to a different tactic. Code enforcement regarding driveway obstructions. The HOA bylaws dictated that driveways could only be used for the temporary parking of functional, registered motor vehicles. Any other objects, debris, or non-automotive items stored on the driveway for more than 24 hours were considered abandoned refuse and were subject to immediate, non-consensual removal by the HOA's contracted towing service. It was a desperate move. They planned to classify whatever was at the base of my tower as debris and have it hauled away to assert dominance. But I had read the minutes of their emergency session. Gary, the accountant, had slipped a copy into my mailbox under the cover of darkness. I knew they were coming, and I knew exactly how to make it physically impossible for them to win. If my driveway was now a legally protected maritime dock for my religious operations, A dock required nautical equipment. I searched industrial salvage yards across South Florida until I found it. A massive rusted cast-iron stockless anchor from a decommissioned cargo barge. It weighed precisely 4,200 pounds. It was 12 feet long and roughly the size of a compact car. I paid a specialized heavy-hauling flatbed to deliver it on Sunday afternoon. We didn't just place it on the concrete. Mike and his crew returned, drilled heavy-duty structural mounting brackets directly into the foundation of my driveway, and bolted the iron anchor to the earth using high-tensile steel bolts, thicker than my wrist. It was now a permanent fixture of the property. Brenda had called the towing company on Monday. Rick showed up Tuesday morning, clearly expecting to tow a broken-down Honda Civic or maybe haul away a pile of construction lumber. Instead, he found himself staring down a piece of nautical hardware that weighed more than his entire truck. Rick wiped sweat from his forehead and walked over to Brenda. "Lady, I can't move that. Even if I disconnect the winch, the suspension on my rig would snap. It's bolted into the bedrock. You need a commercial crane and a permit from the city to unearth that thing." "You are a tow truck!" Brenda screamed, completely losing her grip on reality. "Tow it! Pull it out of the ground! The HOA is authorizing the removal of this debris." Rick looked at Brenda like she was an alien. "I'm not destroying my rig for your neighborhood drama, lady. I'm billing you for the call-out fee." He walked to the back of his truck, unhooked the taut, straining cable from the top ring of the anchor, and threw the heavy hook into the bed of his truck. He climbed into the cab, gunned the engine, and drove off, leaving a cloud of black diesel smoke hanging in the humid air. I took another slow, luxurious sip of my coffee. "Looks like you're going to need a bigger boat, Brenda." She spun around to face me, her hands balled into fists. "This isn't over, Jack. You think you're so smart with your loopholes and your federal nonsense. You are creating a public nuisance. I am calling the police. I am reporting a hostile sovereign citizen encampment on this property. They will arrest you. They will condemn this property. And I will personally watch them cut that abomination down with a blowtorch." "Please," I said, gesturing to the street with my coffee mug. "Call them. I'd love to chat with the officers. In fact, why don't you use my phone?" She didn't take my phone. She pulled out her own, her fingers trembling with rage as she dialed 911. She backed away from my property line, pacing aggressively on the sidewalk, shouting into the receiver about a dangerous, radicalized resident building illegal fortifications and hoarding nautical equipment in his driveway. I didn't panic. I just turned around, walked back into my house, and went straight to my home office. I opened my Notion board. Phase 2. The siege of Station 4 was officially active. I pulled open my bottom desk drawer and took out a thick, heavy-duty binder labeled the captain's log. Inside were all my original notarized FCC documents, my FHA religious protection certificates, the structural engineering sign-offs from Mike's crew, and a printed, highlighted copy of the Florida state statutes regarding false police reports and civil harassment. I walked back out to the porch, sat down in a rocking chair, and waited. The trap was set. Brenda thought she was calling in the cavalry to crush me. She didn't realize she was just inviting witnesses to her own professional execution. It took exactly 14 minutes for the Boca Raton Police Department to arrive. I honestly thought it would take longer, given how ridiculous Brenda's 911 call must have sounded. But I guess when a frantic HOA president starts throwing around buzzwords like radicalized encampment and hostile nautical structures, the dispatcher has to take it seriously. 2 cruisers turned onto my street, their lights flashing silently, washing the manicured lawns in red and blue. Brenda practically sprinted toward them before the cars even came to a complete stop. She threw herself at the driver's side window of the lead cruiser, waving her arms and pointing back at me, literally hyperventilating. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but it looked like a frantic game of charades where the secret phrase was, "Arrest that man." 2 officers stepped out. They looked young, maybe late 20s, and they instantly had that exhausted, tight-jawed expression of cops who realize they've been called to a suburban dispute instead of a real crime. They unclipped the retention straps on their holsters, standard protocol for a hostile encampment call, and started walking slowly up my driveway, their eyes darting from the 4,000-pound iron anchor up the 40-foot steel lattice tower, and finally resting on the giant Jolly Roger flapping aggressively in the wind. I didn't move. I just sat in my rocking chair, took another sip of my coffee, and gave them a friendly nod. "Morning, officers," I called out, my tone perfectly even. "Beautiful day for a broadcast." The lead officer, a tall guy with a nameplate that read Ramirez, held up a hand, gesturing for me to stay seated. "Sir, we got a call about a disturbance. Something about an illegal structure and aggressive behavior. Can you tell us what's going on here?" Brenda marched up right behind them, practically foaming at the mouth. "He is building a fortress. He is threatening the community. Look at that pirate flag. He is an unhinged sovereign citizen, and I want him removed from the premises." "Ma'am, please step back," the second officer, Davies, said firmly, putting himself between Brenda and my porch. "Let us handle this." Officer Ramirez looked back at me, his eyes squinting against the morning sun. "Sir, is that a ship's anchor in your driveway?" "It is," I said, leaning forward and resting my elbows on my knees. "It's a functional mooring device for Sovereign Maritime Relay Station 4, which is precisely why I've been expecting you." I picked up the captain's log from the small table next to my chair, stood up slowly, keeping my hands entirely visible, and walked down the steps. Ramirez tensed slightly, but I just handed him the heavy, tabbed binder. "Officer Ramirez, I completely understand why you were called out here," I said, using my most reasonable, cooperative corporate project manager voice. "Mrs. Brenda here is the HOA president, and she has been aggressively trying to force me to dismantle my federally licensed amateur radio station. I mean, honestly, it's been a nightmare. I'm just trying to operate within my federal rights, and she's been harassing me." Ramirez blinked, looking down at the binder. "Radio station?" "Yes, sir," I said, opening the binder to the first red tab. "Right there is my official Federal Communications Commission HAM radio operator license, complete with my call sign. And the document behind it is the FCC PRB1 regulation and the OTRD rules. Basically, federal law dictates that local municipalities and HOAs are strictly prohibited from restricting my ability to erect and maintain an operational communications antenna. This tower is fully permitted, structurally engineered, and protected by the federal government." Ramirez spent a solid 2 minutes reading the highlighted sections. Davies peered over his shoulder. You could visibly see the tension leaving their bodies, replaced instantly by immense, profound annoyance. Not at me, but at Brenda. "Okay," Ramirez said slowly, digesting the legalese. "So this massive metal pole is a legal radio antenna. But what about the pirate flag? And the anchor?" "I am so glad you asked," I said, flipping to the blue tab. "Because that's where the civil rights violations come in. I am a legally ordained minister of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Pastafarianism is a recognized religion in the United States. Under my religious tenets, pirate regalia is sacred. That flag is a religious symbol. I've included the applicable sections of the Federal Fair Housing Act, which explicitly protects my right to display religious iconography on my property without HOA interference. The anchor is merely a structural aesthetic piece, complementing my religious space." Brenda let out a sound that was half gasp, half shriek. "He is making this up! It's a loophole! It's malicious!" Officer Davies looked at Brenda, then looked at the anchor, and finally looked up at the giant skull and crossbones snapping in the wind. He clamped a hand over his mouth, coughing loudly to hide what was unmistakably a laugh. Ramirez closed the binder and handed it back to me. He looked completely exhausted. He turned to Davies. Wait, so legally, this isn't a pirate ship? It's a federally protected religious radio station? I smiled, offering a slight, respectful bow. Aye, officer. Can I offer you some rum? I mean, a LaCroix? Davies actually choked on his own spit, having to turn away to regain his composure. Ramirez rubbed the bridge of his nose, taking a deep breath before turning to face Brenda, who looked like she was about to spontaneously combust. Ma'am, Ramirez said, his voice hard and utterly devoid of patience. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one. This man has provided federal documentation proving that his installation is protected. He is not building a fortress, he is not a sovereign citizen, and he is not committing a crime. But the bylaws, Brenda screeched, stamping her foot on the pavement like a toddler. The community aesthetic guidelines. The Boca Raton Police Department does not enforce HOA aesthetic guidelines, ma'am, Ramirez said, stepping toward her to corral her away from my property line. And honestly, if you keep calling 911 because you don't like your neighbor's landscaping, I am going to cite you for misuse of the emergency broadcast system. Do not call us out here for this again. Do you understand? Brenda was shaking. She looked at the officers, looked at me, and realized in that exact moment that the ultimate authority she worshipped, the police, had just completely invalidated her power. She didn't say a word. She just spun around, marched across the lawns, and disappeared into her house across the street, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Have a safe shift, officers, I said, waving as they got back into their cruisers. Davies gave me a subtle thumbs up through the window before they drove off. I knew it was a massive victory, but I also knew Brenda. People like her, people who build their entire identity around enforcing minor rules, do not just accept defeat. When their legal avenues are exhausted, they resort to desperate, irrational measures. I moved Phase 3, the trap, into the active column on my Notion board. It was time to secure the perimeter. Over the next few days, Whispering Pines descended into a weird kind of Cold War. Half the neighborhood treated me like a folk hero. Gary the accountant actually left a 6-pack of imported stout on my porch with a sticky note that just said, "Give 'em hell, Captain." The other half, Brenda's loyalists, glared at me from their windows and aggressively watered their lawns whenever I checked my mail. But I wasn't focused on the neighbors. I was focused on my security infrastructure. I spent the weekend installing 4 ultra-high-definition 4K night vision security cameras. I positioned them specifically to cover every possible angle of the radio tower, the anchor, and the structural guy wires. I hardwired the DVR into a battery backup and synced the feed directly to my phone. I knew she was going to make a move. I just had to wait. It happened on a Thursday night, almost 2 weeks after the police incident. It was 2:14 a.m. I was dead asleep when the silent alarm on my phone triggered, vibrating aggressively on my nightstand. I sat up, my heart pounding, and unlocked the screen, the feed from camera 3, the one pointed directly at the base of the tower, was live. And there she was. Honestly, I almost felt bad for her, because it was literally the most pathetic thing I had ever seen. Brenda was dressed in what I can only describe as suburban tactical gear. She was wearing a black turtleneck, black yoga pants, and a black beanie pulled down low over her forehead. She was creeping across my lawn, crouching low to avoid the streetlights, moving with all the stealth of a drunken rhinoceros. and in her hands, she carried a massive pair of industrial bolt cutters. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't grab a baseball bat. I just sat on the edge of my bed, hit the record button on the app, and watched the felony unfold in crystal-clear, infrared high definition. She reached the base of the tower and paused, looking around frantically. She didn't go for the anchor. She knew that was impossible. She didn't go for the flag itself, because it was 30 feet in the air. Instead, she moved to the thick, high-tensile steel guy wires anchoring the mast to the concrete. These were the structural supports. She clamped the massive jaws of the bolt cutters around the primary starboard cable. She strained, putting her entire body weight into the handles. The cutters bit into the steel, gnawing through the protective coating and severing the inner braided wire. Snap! The wire gave way, whipping through the air and slapping against the metal tower with a loud, metallic clang. She jumped back, terrified by the noise, but when no lights came on, she grew emboldened. She moved to the second wire. That was all I needed. I had the footage. She had crossed the line from petty nuisance to federal criminal. I reached over to my nightstand and pressed the panic button on my smart home remote. Instantly, 4 massive 5,000-lumen LED floodlights mounted on the eaves of my roof snapped on, bathing the entire driveway in blinding, daytime-level white light. Brenda shrieked, a high, piercing sound of pure terror, and dropped the bolt cutters on the concrete. She threw her hands up over her face, stumbling backward over the grass. I casually opened my front door, wearing my waffle-knit bathrobe, holding my phone up. "Smile for the FCC, Brenda," I called out into the night. She didn't say a word. She scrambled to her feet, practically tripping over her own black yoga pants, and sprinted back across the street, leaving the bolt cutters behind as physical evidence. I walked out, picked up the cutters, and examined the severed wire. It didn't compromise the tower. Mike's engineering was over-spec'd, and the mast could hold up without one wire. But legally, it was a gold mine. I didn't call the local police. Local cops don't care about severed wires. I went back inside, booted up my computer, and filed an emergency, expedited complaint directly with the Enforcement Bureau of the Federal Communications Commission in Washington, D.C., under 47 U.S.C., Part 353, willful or malicious interference with licensed radio communications or tampering with licensed transmission infrastructure is a severe federal offense. I attached the 4K video file. I attached copies of her previous citations. I attached the police report from the prior week. I built a case file so ironclad it could have sunk a battleship. Then, I waited for the bureaucracy to grind its gears. It took 5 days. On Tuesday afternoon, Brenda called an emergency, all-hands meeting of the Whispering Pines HOA board, opening it up to the entire neighborhood. The flyer she stuffed in everyone's mailbox claimed she was going to address the ongoing safety crisis at Lot 42 and propose a special assessment fee to hire private security. She was trying to rally the mob. She was trying to paint me as a domestic terrorist so the neighborhood would turn on me. I arrived at the clubhouse at exactly 6:55 p.m. The parking lot was completely full. People were standing in the back of the room. The atmosphere was thick, humid, and buzzing with gossip. Brenda sat at the head table, flanked by her 4 nervous board members, looking incredibly smug. I walked down the center aisle. The room went dead silent. I had dressed for the occasion. I wore a crisp, tailored navy blue suit. But over my left eye, I wore a perfectly fitted medical-grade black leather eye patch. It was subtle. It was professional. It was absolutely devastating. I took a seat in the very front row, crossing my legs, resting my briefcase on my lap. Brenda glared at me, her eye twitching slightly at the eye patch. She slammed her wooden gavel onto the table. "This emergency meeting is now called to order. The primary item on the agenda is the dangerous, unauthorized, and frankly psychotic construction project at Lot 42. Jack has refused to comply with our aesthetic guidelines, and his behavior has escalated to a point where I am recommending we file a restraining order and hire contractors to forcefully demolish his so-called radio tower." A murmur of agreement rippled through Brenda's loyalists. Gary the accountant groaned loudly from the back row. "Before we vote on the special assessment," Brenda continued, raising her chin, "does the homeowner of Lot 42 have any final, desperately misguided words to say in his defense?" I stood up slowly, unlatched my briefcase, and pulled out a single, thick envelope. It had an official federal seal stamped in the top left corner. "I don't have a defense, Brenda," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "Because I'm not the one on trial. But I do have some correspondence I think the board might want to hear. It arrived by certified federal courier this morning." I opened the envelope and pulled out the heavily embossed letterhead of the Federal Communications Commission Enforcement Bureau. "This is an official notice of apparent liability and cease and desist directive from the federal government," I read, projecting my voice, "addressed to the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association Board of Directors, and specifically naming Brenda." Brenda's smug expression instantly vanished. "What is that? That's fake. You printed that." "Oh, it's very real," I said, stepping closer to the table and laying a duplicate copy directly in front of the 4 other board members. They recoiled from it like it was radioactive. Let me summarize. Last Thursday, at 2:14 a.m., a board member engaged in the physical sabotage of a federally licensed telecommunications facility. This act of tampering was captured on 4K infrared video, which the FCC has reviewed and authenticated. A collective gasp echoed through the clubhouse. People were literally leaning out of their chairs. "Under federal law," I continued, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, "tampering with this infrastructure is a felony. The FCC is formally notifying the HOA that any further interference, harassment, or attempts to restrict the operation of Sovereign Maritime Relay Station 4 will result in immediate federal sanctions. And here is the best part." I paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. "The fines for these violations," I said, looking directly into Brenda's terrified eyes, "are levied at a base rate of $22,000 per day per infraction. And because this board knowingly acted outside its legal authority, the FCC has indicated that these fines will pierce the corporate veil of the HOA. Which means—" I turned to look at the 4 other board members, who were now sweating profusely. "The federal government will be seizing your personal bank accounts, your retirement funds, and placing liens on your individual homes to satisfy the debt." Chaos erupted. Absolute, unmitigated chaos. One of the board members, a retired dentist named Arthur, practically leaped out of his chair, knocking it backward. "Brenda! You said you were just taking photos of his yard. You cut his wires? Are you out of your mind?" "It's a lie!" Brenda screamed over the noise, her face flushed dark purple. "He's a menace. I was protecting property values." "You just exposed us to federal bankruptcy," another board member yelled, pointing a trembling finger at her. I just stood there, adjusting my suit jacket. "The FCC has graciously offered a settlement window. They will pause the formal enforcement action and the criminal referral to the Department of Justice on one condition." The room instantly quieted down again. Arthur the dentist leaned across the table, looking at me with desperate, pleading eyes. "What? What's the condition? We'll do whatever they want." "The FCC requires the immediate, permanent cessation of all hostility," I said smoothly. "But personally, I require a bit more to withdraw my complaint. I will call the Enforcement Bureau tomorrow and drop the case entirely. But only if this board holds a vote, right now on the record, to completely and permanently abolish Section 4, Paragraph B, and Addendum 4C of the bylaws. No more restrictions on flags. No more bans on poles. Total architectural amnesty for fabric displays." Brenda slammed her hands on the table. "Absolutely not! I will not let this neighborhood turn into a circus." Arthur didn't even look at her. He grabbed her gavel, snatched it out of her hand, and slammed it down himself. "I make a motion to abolish Section 4, Paragraph B, and Addendum 4C immediately. Do I have a second?" "Second!" the other 3 board members yelled in unison. "All in favor?" Arthur shouted. "Aye!" they roared. "Motion passes," Arthur gasped, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked at me. "It's done. It's off the books. Please call Washington. Tell them we surrendered." "I also make a motion," Gary the accountant yelled from the back of the room, standing up on his chair, "for a vote of no confidence to immediately remove Brenda as HOA president." The cheers in the clubhouse were deafening. It was a complete mutiny. Brenda looked around the room, realizing that every single person she had spent the last 2 years bullying was now actively cheering for her downfall. She grabbed her metal clipboard, burst into tears, and ran out the side door of the clubhouse. I took off my eye patch, folded the FCC letter back into my suit pocket, and walked out the front doors into the warm, humid Florida night. The next morning was beautiful. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the air smelled like victory. I walked out into my driveway, a fresh cup of dark roast coffee in my hand, and stood next to the massive iron anchor. I looked up at the 40-foot steel lattice tower. The Jolly Roger was snapping lazily in the gentle morning breeze, the stark white skull grinning down at the neighborhood. But it wasn't the only flag flying that morning. Across the street, Gary the accountant was on a stepladder, proudly mounting a massive bright pink flag featuring a cartoon flamingo drinking a margarita. 2 houses down, the soccer family had erected a 20-foot telescoping pole flying the flag of the United Federation of Planets from Star Trek. By the end of the week, Whispering Pines looked less like a beige suburban prison and more like a chaotic, colorful festival. I never did hook up that ham radio. I mean, honestly, who has the time? But the tower stays. The anchor stays. And whenever I see a new, ridiculous flag go up in the neighborhood, I just smile, take a sip of my coffee, and know that Sovereign Maritime Relay Station 4 is successfully holding the line.